You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks, and sitting here again with Mike Kofman, who is fresh back from his latest research trip to Ukraine with some of his comrades, Rob Lee, Franz Stefan Gatti, and Konrad Muzikot. Mike, glad you made it out safe. What are some of the big takeaways?
Thanks, Ron. Good to be back. So I think my base impression is that the current situation is not dire, but naturally trending in a negative direction following the retreat of Ukrainian forces from Avdiivka. My impression is that the Ukrainian military is actively working to stabilize the front line. And it might be a bit too soon to say that stabilize, but at least for the moment, it looks like it's trending in that direction, certainly at least until the next major set of Russian offensive operations. My view is that Ukraine right now is dealing with three interrelated challenges, and I'd broadly describe them as manpower, fortifications, and the continued issue of a deficit of ammunition. And that Ukraine is at least on a path to resolve the issue of fortifications and building defensive lines. There is a vision to address the manpower issue, but I think that's the most acute problem and the one that has the longest lead time to solve, why the next several months are important. And on the issue of ammunition and supply, that I think substantially depends on Western support, both what happens here in Washington, D.C. in Congress, and also the extent to which European countries are able to get their act together on production, and this purchase proposal by the Czechs to buy ammunition outside of the European Union.
So let's slow down and talk about some of those, because you just raised some really big issues. I want to start with the manpower one. And this was the main subject of episode you and Rob just did of the Russia contingency, which is available for War on the Rocks members. You touched on this heavily. It was a fascinating discussion. There is a law that's scheduled for its second reading, but not for a few more weeks, I believe. And, the second reading is after it passes the second reading, it can then pass and become law. But it seems like this process of Ukraine passing legislation to mobilize more manpower when there is a major shortage, especially of infantry, and the median age of the front is about 40-something years old, this legislation has been going through, given the context, at a snail's pace. I mean, the administration didn't even submit the legislation until December. Then they withdrew it in January, and then they submitted new legislation at the end of January. And now we're in March, in the middle of March, and it still hasn't passed. It almost feels like Ukraine thinks they have more time than they do. It's hard for me to understand this.
Sure. And the short answer is that time is actually running out. If we look at the decisions that have to be made to address all three of these problems. So my sense of it is that on the mobilization law, and that's not the only aspect of the manpower problem. There are actually three pieces to this. And the first one is conducting an audit of the force, which the Ukrainian military is currently doing, figuring out what they really have, who's where, who's performing combat tasks, and rationalizing the force. The second is addressing the recruitment and mobilization process, which I think has a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of things that need to be changed just about it, how people are mobilized, what happens to when they're mobilized, how people are able to sign voluntary contracts. And the third is digital mobilization, which is about generating additional manpower, but it's also most importantly about changing the terms of service. Because right now, if you're mobilized in Ukraine and you're inducted into the military, it's in many ways a one-way ticket, especially if you join the infantry. About 70% of casualties tend to stack in the infantry specialty. And the only way out is if you're killed or wounded in action. So naturally, a lot of folks looking at mobilization as a one-way ticket are not nearly that motivated by the proposition. And so the law is not just about getting more people, more men, or getting younger men into service. It's about creating a fair policy for how people are mobilized It's also about setting limits to terms of service. One of the things under debate is a 36 months limit to terms of service, and making clear to people what their way out is and what can they expect in the military, et cetera, et cetera. And last point on this. So in the politics of it, yeah, the president seemed to have kicked it over to the parliament. The parliament is filled with also other parties other than his parties. It's become heavily politicized, of course. Politics have been back in Ukraine very safely since last year.
But Zelensky's not putting his political capital behind this fully. He doesn't give a lot of speeches about it. It seems like it's not a priority for him.
And it was visible that one of the many reasons for his feud with Zaluzhny in the run-up to all of this was that he likely wanted Zaluzhny to front the requirements for mobilization. And at least that's my interpretation of it. And now it's sort of in the Rada, and there's 4,000 amendments proposed to the law. And yeah, it has been kind of stalled in committee. Now, folks should keep in mind that there's a great deal that the military leadership and the Ministry of Defense is likely doing behind the scenes to address these other first two issues that I raised, right? Actually auditing and rationalizing the force and the recruitment problem. But bottom line, Ukraine needs to pass a mobilization law to address these core issues. It needs more manpower, and it needs a sustainable way forward on this issue. And it needs to both find a way to replace the losses from last year and to address the kind of declining manning levels, because my view is that if Ukraine can address its manpower issues, which require considerable lead time, why there needs to be real movement on this and a sense that there's a plan and a way forward in the next couple of months, and it is already working on fortifications, and the United States, along with European countries, are able to come through to some degree on material assistance and ammunition, because the manpower issue is interrelated with the material assistance issue. Ukraine wants to have a sense that they're going to get some funding support this year and that they'll be able to arm and equip these actual units once they mobilize the men. Then Ukraine can hold, okay? But if I look at the most critical factors, outside of what's being debated here in Washington, D.C., material assistance and Western support, for Ukraine, it's definitely manpower this year. And that's going to be one that takes the longest time to resolve. Because if the laws pass tomorrow, right, it probably will be 60 days notice for folks after that. Then it'll be a couple months after that before the whatever.
Well, and they're not even ready to kick off that 60-day process, I would say, right after it passes. We're talking about 3 months before it.
Sure. Yeah. Even more if you consider how long it'll take to train these folks, and then the challenge of getting through the current throughput rate. Like, let's say you're taking X number of people per month, right? Now you're mobilizing a whole bunch of people to both make up for the losses of the past 6 months and to generate additional combat power. It's not going to be that easy to go from, X to 3X or 4X. It might be on paper, but in real life, when you try to do these things, it's not going to be that easy to intake these folks as well. So all of this has lead times. And why I've been emphasizing this point since I've come back is it's become eminently clear to me that Ukraine is getting on top of fortifications. If we get the funding that they need, we can be shipping ammo and providing other things relatively quickly. I mean, a conversation in terms of weeks, all right? But the manpower issue is one that will take months to resolve. It will take time. And if it's not addressed, then yeah, I very much worry about Ukraine's situation in the second half of this year.
Let's talk about where you went on this most recent trip. So I know obviously you went to Kyiv, you took some meetings there, but where else did you go?
Where we spent most of our time is along the Zaporizhia axis in the south, past Avdiivka towards the Chasiv Yar, kind of around Bakhmut area, north of that towards the axis along Kremina Liman, and also down further southwest in Kherson on the right side of the riverbank. And that's the side that's primarily supporting the lodgement and the naval infantry that's fighting in Krinky, for folks who are familiar with the map, basically around Kherson City. So basically, we were, as I like to say, engaging with units sort of in these broad areas, in these sectors. I won't say that we went everywhere along the front line, because people have to understand that the front line is close to 1,000 kilometers in length, but I would say had a sense or sampling, at least, of most of it, the better part of it, and engagements with different types of units. Because as I've often come to learn from doing this work, if all you know is one battle or one operational direction, and you think that's the entirety of the war, then you're mistaken. That's just one particular situation, one fight. And the second thing is that if you've talked to only a couple of units in one particular area, then you know their experience and what their fight's been like, but it's going to look quite different in another part of the line. And so you need to have a decent enough sampling of what's actually happening along the front.
I know one of the things you were looking at, particularly on this trip, was how drones were being used by different units. What are some of the things you learned about that? I know this is going to be the subject of a Russia contingency episode, so just give us a preview.
Sure. So I think that first, the issue of drones is particularly interesting because it's rapidly evolving in its employment both as a technology and the tactics associated with it. And a lot has been written. A lot of ink has been spilled on this over the past year that I've read. And I'll be frank, I think quite a few things I've read over the past year are not quite correct, just based on my experience and what I found traveling around Ukraine. And what I've learned is first that drones are a useful offset to the deficit of traditional conventional capabilities like artillery ammunition, or maybe anti-tank guided missiles, but they are still primarily a crutch rather than a solution to that problem. They're much more effective on the defense than they are in supporting offensive operations. They are not a substitute, at least right now, for major conventional systems such as artillery. The contest between drones and electronic warfare systems that counter them is a very narrow one. They are evolving sort of in tandem or very close to each other. And there's an active debate to what extent will standard traditional drones that you see like first-person restrike drones, how effective they're going to be even come summer. What I also saw is a growing integration and sophistication in the employment of drones and electronic warfare systems along the front line by both sides. I saw much growing sort of complexity in how Ukrainian forces were employing them. And also that while the early employment of strike drones, such as first-person view drones, last summer, fall, had become a contest in quantity, Ukraine was increasingly catching up on quantity, but that the matchup was evolving much more now in a qualitative direction because electronic warfare was becoming much more effective in dealing with drones. And still, core issues with drone employment remain unresolved, which is, look, you can only have a couple drones on the same frequencies operating in the same space and time. So you do not generate volume of fires. Coordination for employing drones is very difficult among units. And there's all sorts of things that drones do, but there's a lot of things that they can't do or that they can't do well yet. And of course, the technology is maturing. So every time you come back, you see that people have modified drones. Drones are now maybe increasingly able to operate at nighttime. They're used at different frequencies, and the tactics for using them change as well. And I'm hoping to get into a lot of this in a conversation with Rob on the next Russia contingency.
And what are some of the other episodes of Russia contingency should we expect? What are the other big topics? I think you have 3 more planned. Drones will be one of them. What are the others?
Drones will definitely be one of them. There will be another one on some of the underserved issues or aspects of this war. And we're likely to go back to at least some of the history of it, because each time we go over time, we collect very interesting tidbits of the history of the early period of the war that we did not know before. And that's also a part of my mission, which is to figure out what really happened, why it happened. What have we learned that's not quite true that we need to change? That we need to change that story, that narrative. And I will tell you that the anecdotes you hear are really fascinating. In and of themselves, they're kind of worthwhile for me. So I think, as always, we'll have down the line a bit more about the history and some of the early battles, and try to talk about these particular turning points in the war. If you remember, I think last year, I, with a group of colleagues, did an article on the Battle of Hostomel. And we did a great episode, at least I really enjoyed the episode with Aaron, on what have we learned now around the 2-year anniversary of this war. So these are some of the things I'm planning. And we'll have a few more historical episodes that actually are not about this war at all. We'll reconnect with people who are writing very interesting things on history of Russia, history of Ukraine, and what have you.
So Russia has just taken Avdiivka and has sort of evened out that pocket in the front. Before we talk about where they go next, tell me some of your observations about Russian force structure, manpower, other surrounding issues.
It's clear that Russia has most of the inertia right now in this war, with the exception of the Black Sea, where Ukraine has restored shipping to well above the levels it was even during the time when they had a grain deal. But on the Russian side, Russia seems to be doing okay with manpower, and they're able to replace their losses. They also seem to be doing fine with artillery ammunition, although I got the sense that the overall asymmetry in fires between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military is not good, but it's holding stably at maybe 5-1 or 6-1 advantage for Russian forces. The bigger problem was the increased use of glide bombs and saturation of the battlefield with glide bomb strikes by the Russian aerospace forces in places like Avdiivka or in Krinky, which was adding to the artillery advantage that Russia had. And they were also being used at greater and greater ranges. And these are not particularly accurate weapons, but when you have a volume of strikes of just bombs coming in.
These aren't precision-guided munitions. I think some people hear glide bombs and they assume that
They are not,
yeah.
although Russia is increasingly putting GPS guidance on them, but in general they're not particularly accurate. But I will tell you, if you see the crater that, the craters that 2 500-kilogram FAB bombs make, they'll make an impression on you. So they may not be accurate, but when a part of the front line is receiving 40 plus, or in peak periods, people report over 80 such bombs per day, it certainly has an effect, right?
So these glide bombs, Russia has a 5 or 6-1 artillery munition advantage and a big production advantage currently.
It does. The two big limitations that Russia is dealing with. The first basic one is on equipment, and that's because they have a certain rate at which they can repair equipment and put it into service, and they're using a lot of
vehicles mostly, or
yeah, vehicles of various type, armored fighting vehicles, what have you, and they're using still equipment primarily from the Soviet stocks or Soviet inheritance. Maybe 20%, just kind of throwing a dart out there, is new production, but most of it, and I mean the overwhelming majority, is still equipment that's coming out of storage. And that means that they're slowly eating through that Soviet inheritance. And the other big issue that they're dealing with is, and it's a challenge Ukrainian forces have as well, inability to employ forces at scale, which is the unit of action typically used as the company or the platoon. And at first, when they tried to encircle Avdiivka, it looked like they were trying to conduct an operation kind of coordinating the battalion level, but very quickly descended back to attacks by fairly small assault groups.
And you're talking about the tip of the spear, of course, which I understand. But one of the points that you and Rob draw out is they are able to, when it comes to support, operate at a much higher level of organization. One of the things that I was surprised to learn from the last episode of Russia Contingency was that when you mentioned that while Russia has engineering battalions to build fortifications, Ukraine does not have battalions organized as engineers, which I was surprised by.
The Ukrainian military, since independence, over time shed parts of that Soviet command structure, but more importantly, command layers in between the brigade and the general staff. And so in the Russian military, you have divisional command, you have combined arms army, you have a corps, and then you have brigades that are dedicated to do logistics, engineering brigades. And so what folks may not appreciate is if you ask the question of, okay, why did nobody build, good secondary lines or multiple layered defense in the Ukrainian military? And the answer is straightforward. First, there isn't something like a combined arms army command that's looking at this theater from this higher echelon, but most importantly, there aren't these dedicated units. So who's supposed to build it? The regular brigade has an engineering battalion, but their job is to dig their forward positions and to entrench their artillery.
Yeah, earlier when I said battalion, I meant brigade, yeah.
But there isn't this other unit whose only job is to dig and that has dedicated equipment, to machine dig trenches, to cement them, which is what the Russian armed forces have. And so force structure does matter. I go back to that point. Having these capabilities, having them dedicated in the military does make a difference. And so now I see the Ukrainian military having a vision for how they're going to set up 3 defensive lines, maybe have the Army's engineers work on the first, and then to the extent that's possible, generate mobilized capacity from within the state, because Ukraine is not short on construction equipment or digging equipment, right? You just need to organize it, you need to contract it, and these lines can be built, and you just have to compensate for the lack of dedicated or organic capability in your units
in the
to
army,
do it.
Yeah. So where does Russia go after Avdiivka?
Right now, the Russian military it's still very much constrained by the fact that it's making incremental gains. It's not in a position to make substantial breakthroughs. But what happened after Avdiivka is Ukrainian retreat from that salient, and it's still not clear where the line will settle, I'll be frank. But
because they're still advancing.
Yeah, they're still advancing, but rather slowly. It allowed Russian forces to inch closer to the city of Pokrovsk, which is a major transit town. It's a transit hub. If you look on the map, a lot of roads intersect there. And it increasingly kind of put Ukrainian rear areas or transit areas within reach of Russian drones. And that's why I suspect, that's why in the last 2 weeks, you have increasingly seen videos of Russian forces being able to take out some high-value assets like NASAMS air defense or Patriot, a couple Patriot launchers, or Ukrainian helicopters most recently. And so the issue's more the problem of a slow creep of Russian forces towards transit hub cities like Pokrovsk. It's clear that the Russian objective is still to take the rest of Donbass, and Pokrovsk is their target. The closer they get to that, the better they are positioned to try to sever the ground lines of communications that run east to west to Donetsk. And they're trying to push to Chasiv Yar, right, west from Bakhmut, because that's the high ground. And if they take it, then they're able to put the other cities lying south of Chasiv Yar at risk, because they still clearly want to take Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. My real sense is that the Russian plan hasn't changed, and that it's simply a question of not as much what Russia can do, but what the state of Ukrainian forces will be going into the second half of this year. And that's why I started off by discussing what I thought the main factors were, what this all hinges on.
Well, we talked about this on the last episode before you went out there, because of the way that the retreat from Avdiivka took place, and also because of Ukraine's inability to hold the line there, and in large part because of munitions being held up in Congress, frankly, right down the road from where we are. They didn't have a chance to build these fortifications in depth, and also some of the organizational problems that we discussed. Where do Ukrainian efforts stand on building fortifications in places where you're likely going to see a Russian advance, and in places where they might need to fall back on from there?
My impression is that they are very actively building a first line of defense. They have a plan of a network of fortification points and defensive points for drone and electronic warfare units, essentially a network of them. It's a line that's going to look different from the major lines of defense that the Russian military built last year that were nicknamed the Surovikin lines. There is a plan for secondary and third line of defense as well, and that's very nascent in terms of construction. Yes, it is very fair to say that they're pretty late to need in doing this, and that's also been the case in mobilization. But there, at least, that's a bright spot, because coming back from Ukraine, I sense that there's a plan, a vision, and I've gotten to work on it. However, I do need to add that why Manpower is so important is you can have whatever defensive scheme you want, but if you don't have the manpower, particularly infantry, to man the first defensive line, then defenses don't defend themselves, and they don't maintain themselves either. You need to have men in defensive lines to even just maintain them, for them not to collapse over time. So that's why I discuss these as interrelated issues. They link to each other. And so with defenses, Ukraine can substantially reduce the amount of manpower it needs to hold the line, the resources involved, but it is also very much incumbent on us to provide funding and ammunition, because that situation is going to steadily deteriorate over time. And as I said, the Russian advantage is not just one of artillery firepower, but also its standoff air power.
Did you learn anything or see anything that really surprised you? I feel like a lot of the stuff you learn, it changes your mind over time, maybe on certain issues as you get more data. It's never anything all at once that's just like, wow, I didn't expect this. But were there any things, big or small, that left an impression because it wasn't quite what you expected on this trip?
It was learned quite a bit, and it's always a challenge to recall. If you listen to me and Rob talk about the Russia contingency, our plan was to do a strategic overview, and sure enough, right off the bat, we just dug into Manpower, because there's two guys who've been traveling for 2 weeks and are tired, and that plan didn't survive first contact with the recording. But the couple things I would highlight. First, I learned quite a bit about air defense, and particularly mobile air defense, how it works, and I was very surprised to learn how effectively Ukraine has found cheap means to counter Russian long-range strike drones with very basic gun-based systems. And the big thing that they needed were enablers, thermal scopes and tablets and what have you. But combined with a network of sensors and electronic warfare systems deployed around the country. And one of the episodes, we're going to dig more into that, actually. We'll talk about the nerdy technical specifics of this, but how effective they were, and that they were intercepting well over 40% of the Shahed drones and cruise missiles with a system of fairly cheap distributed air defense that was mobile. And I thought this was really neat. And it's actually a very useful kind of case for other countries like the Baltic states who don't have the means to invest in lots of advanced missile-based air defense, right? Many countries cannot afford to buy integrated air defense of this type. But the short answer is there's a cheaper way to do it.
Yeah, someone said recently, it's like when they said Germany, it was important for them to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, that 2% of GDP in Germany is the size of Estonia's entire GDP. So these are smaller countries, not as rich as some of the larger countries.
Yeah, and so what I basically learned is actually, you can come up with solutions that are cheaper, that are effective, and their effectiveness can also increase substantially with fairly cheap enabling technologies that are available. And I found this was pretty neat, but most importantly, it was important to learn how it actually works, right? Because a lot of us see shoot downs. We try to get a sense of the interaction of air defense of Russian strikes, but you really have to dig into how this stuff works, right? So this was one really neat takeaway. And a second one, maybe as an example. So increasingly in the Russian forces, there's been a growing pattern of the threat of sort of summary execution as disciplinary action that commanders could employ, and Russian units fight, right? And I've seen plenty of footage of Russian soldiers who are wounded in action rather than being captured or whatever, commit suicide. And by the way, I do not recommend anybody go online to search for these. But what was interesting to me is that this was a tactic associated early in 2023 with Wagner. Okay, and what I increasingly have come to believe, and this is an early stage of my thinking on the subject, is that the Battle of Bakhmut did not destroy Wagner. What it did is it sort of burst the organization, and it increasingly spread those tactics of Wagner that were seen as the most effective to the rest of the Russian armed forces. And these include the use of storm assault groups. This includes the use of convicts in different types. Now there are Sturm V and Sturm Z units.
Well, and the Ukrainian government just submitted a bill to use convicts also in their forces. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
So the proliferation of the use of convict units distributed as companies to various standard sort of regular formations, and the use of disciplinary actions akin to, not exactly, but fairly close to the practices of Wagner's in a number of cases, and that this expanding along the front. And so, yeah, I don't know if this makes sense. It's probably a bit of a stretch to talk a bit about sort of the Wagnerization of the Russian armed forces, but it is interesting to me to see that some of these practices from Wagner are alive and well, and rather than being confined to one organization that was fighting this way in the Battle of Bakhmut for 9 months, they actually proliferate to the Russian armed forces writ large. And each time you go, you learn more and more about how Russian forces fight, how that changes over time, and how they're able to maintain discipline and keep people attacking. Because you look at videos and you see them pushing assault groups over and over again, and these guys get killed. And you might say, like, well, what's motivating them to do that? And believe it or not, money is a huge factor. And a lot of the intercepts that at least Ukrainians have of these troops show that their wives or girlfriends are telling them, you should sign up for an assault group. We're going to get a lot more money if you do that. Yeah, of course, it's also by far the best way to get killed.
Sounds like very functional relationships. This is why I don't get married.
Yeah, you actually see that money is a huge motivator. And of course, harsh disciplinary action and threat of use of force is also a big motivator as well. And bottom line, I would wrap it up by saying this, that although it doesn't seem like Russia's generating enough manpower to really rotate the people they initially mobilized back in late 2022, it is clear that last year they were able to contract a very large amount of men, and they were able to replace their losses, and they were able to generate additional combat formations to conduct offensives like the Avdiivka one, right? And that this asymmetry is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that Ukraine is going to have to address with Western help this year.
Thanks, Mike, for joining us, and thank you for listening to the War on the Rocks podcast. You can listen to the Russia Contingency, among many other members-only podcasts, by signing up to be a War on the Rocks member at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.